Okay, in this lecture we're going to address the topic of possible worlds. And also we're going to do some consideration of God's middle knowledge. Dr. Nash does address that in this chapter as well. At times when we're going through this chapter, it may sound like just I'm reading the text to you, but it's because I want to read the things that people find problematic and then comment on them. So a little caveat at the beginning. This is referred to as modal, means having to do with what could be, with possibility. This is referred to as modal logic and counterfactuals. Counterfactuals are different scenarios regarding how the world is and how it might be. They seem to throw a lot of my students for a loop. And so this is my attempt to explain and assist you when you're addressing this topic. And since this text is an intro to philosophy text, and this is an intro to philosophy course, I've thought about not covering the chapter, but it does have some useful takeaways that I think make struggling with it ultimately worthwhile. And you're going to have to take that on faith, because some of you have tried to read this chapter and found that it frustrated you and made you want to pull your hair. In philosophy, this sort of thing is referred to as modal reasoning, and it's helpful for differentiating between the essential or the necessary properties of something and the non-essential or the contingent properties of reality, and also of persons. Possible worlds thought is also used in physics, and it's used in some forms of higher mathematics. One of the things you need to get clear on right at the beginning is that world does not mean the earth. World here means the universe, everything, every tiny thing from the smallest to the largest, all of known reality equals a world in possible worlds terminology. Propositions, which Dr. Nash addresses, are the particular details of the account or story that's being given about a particular possible world. So these are things that are true in that world. One thing to get clear at the beginning, again I say, is that world does not mean the earth. World means the universe, all of known reality. So world, not earth. World is a complete account of all reality. I just want to reiterate that. Then when we talk about God's middle knowledge being spoken of here, it is clearly something the Bible teaches to be a reality, which is to say that God not only knows all of what is and all of what has been and will be, but God also knows all that could be. He knows all the alternative scenarios. He knows what would happen if some aspect of this world or this reality were slightly changed. He knows how things would have turned out in your life if you'd taken a different path than the one you have followed that's brought you to where you are right now. And it turns out that God's knowledge of this is a very good thing. If he didn't know these things, in one sense, he really would not be God, the God we encounter in the scriptures. So into Nash, this is page 209. He says, during many of our school days, good teachers introduced heuristic devices or teaching tools. This is a way to come at something you're trying to teach sort of obliquely, or from a direction that allows you to see it differently. Heuristic devices or teaching tools to assist our understanding of rather complex ideas. The doctrine of possible worlds, as odd as it can seem to you at first, can help improve our understanding of dozens of important philosophical issues, and indeed Nash gets into a number of them, but we don't go deep into any of them. For example, philosophers distinguish between contingent and necessary truths. As we'll see, the doctrine of possible worlds can help us grasp this distinction. We first encountered this in Aristotle, by the way. So a warning, he says, some students find this material quite difficult. It really isn't, but any new way of talking or thinking about things can seem difficult at first. Master the definitions, this is an exhortation from him, think about what I say, and remember that much of this material is simply common sense. Once you understand what is going on and what the terms mean, the language of possible worlds will be a new way of talking about things that we are familiar with. And if you're a Christian individual who's interested in the defense of the faith, perhaps the one who does the most speaking about possible worlds as far as things that are available on YouTube would be the philosopher Alvin Plantinga, who was for many years the head of the philosophy department at Notre Dame, and then also the Christian apologist William Lane Craig, in his discussions of God's middle knowledge, does a lot with possible worlds as well. So if you're interested in this kind of thing, if it grabs you, those are the two guys you want to go look for online. Alvin Plantinga and William Lane Craig. All right, so this is me trying to give you both things at the same time, a proposition and a state of affairs, rather than giving you all the verbiage having to do with it. A proposition, looking just at the left-hand column, is a declarative statement about a fact or how things are. And it has to be closed. It has to be like you see in 1998, the 1997, exist in 1991, as far as these things with Clinton and the Florida Marlins and the USSR. The state of affairs is, he says it's hard to explain what a state of affairs is, but let me show you by this example. So if you have Bill Clinton as president of the U.S. in 1998, Bill Clinton's being president of the U.S. in 1998 is the state of affairs. You could say that Donald J. Trump is president of the United States in 2025, and you could say the state of affair is Donald J. Trump's being president of the United States in 2025, if that makes sense. The state of affairs is what exists as a consequence of that proposition being true. When a proposition is true, we say that the corresponding state of affairs obtains. This is not obtains like gets or receives or has. This is a different way of speaking and using the word obtains, and when you use it outside of philosophy, people will be puzzled because it is not the way they're used to hearing the word expressed. But it means that it exists, it is the case. So when a proposition is false, we say that the corresponding state of affairs does not obtain, but when it's true, we say that it obtains. That's what actually is the case. Many philosophers believe that propositions and states of affairs are eternal and unchanging entities. And he doesn't hit the pause button, but he says, before you throw the book, meaning his book, at someone, stop and reflect for a moment about the systems of Plato and Augustine, who believed in the existence of unchanging and eternal universals. According to Plato and Augustine, the properties of truth and goodness have always existed and can never change. For Plato, it's in the world of the forms. For Augustine, it's in the mind of God. So this is still Nash. If P is a proposition, then P has always existed, if this is the real world. Moreover, if P is true, then it has always been true. This is just me commenting on this. So it is accurate to say this as long as we close the propositional sentence in terms of time. If we say, Mary is very hungry right now, that's an open statement as regards time, so it does not qualify as a proposition. But if we say, Mary was very hungry on Wednesday, April 9th, 2025 at 7:30 p.m., that's specific and it's closed. In possible worlds terminology, propositions are bounded or closed in terms of time. If we're to describe that proposition in terms of being a state of affairs, it would be this way. Mary's being hungry on Wednesday, April 9th, 2025 at 7:30 p.m. That's the state of affairs. So Dr. Nash puts it this way. He says, the doctrine that propositions are eternally true requires any sentence that is in effect open because of some reference to time or place to be closed. This can be done by eliminating tensed verbs and making explicit any relevant information that may only be implied in the original. He goes on to tell us that all true propositions are eternally true, that they have always been true. And that means in terms of what was going to be. He says this is all because all true propositions exist in the mind of God. And he goes on to explain, he says, hearken back to Augustine's conviction that all of Plato's forms are eternal ideas in the mind of God. If that is a respectable claim, then why should there be any greater problem in believing that properly framed propositions are eternal truths in the mind of God? And he's going to come back and show you your own life in that from that lens. So this means all true propositions are eternal entities. Now he says something that's like interactive with you as the reader, which is not so much a modern thing as a postmodern thing. Postmodern writers like to actually interact with their readers. So he says to you, since a solid grasp of everything that thus far is essential to understanding what comes next, let me suggest that the reader return to the beginning of this chapter and read to this point. If you do this, place a check on this spot. And reward yourself with a favorite snack, possibly a donut and a cup of coffee. When you have finished, write on a piece of paper a properly formulated proposition that tenselessly describes what you just did, and then write the corresponding state of affairs. Now, here's where he's messing with you. Don't allow the fact that the proposition and state of affairs you have just recorded are eternally true to shock you. So if you actually really did go back, reread this, reward yourself with a cup of coffee and a donut, he's saying that's an eternally true state of affairs. It was always true. Of course, this will be the case only if you did this brief assignment correctly. All this will mean is that God has always known that you would do what you just did, at this time and this place. So he's trying to get you to play a little with him and try to engage with him by doing this. Okay, now getting down to business, that's me, not him. A possible world is a way the real world could have been. The language of possible worlds is a handy way of referring to the possibility that things in the actual world might have been different. That's what we mean when we call this modal and speak of modality. It's the idea of possibility as opposed to necessity. Like, what if the South won the Civil War? Or what if the Third Reich won World War II in Europe? Or what if your mom and dad had never met? Or if you were born blind? Those are modal kinds of discussions. It's not about the way things are, about a way they might have been. As Nash states, all that is required to have a possible world that is different from the real world is for one state of affairs that obtains, in the real world, to be altered in one respect. How many possible worlds are there? Well, obviously the answer is a very large number, because these are just worlds of possibility, right? They're not what is, they are what could have been. And so he talks about two kinds of possibility. Logical possibility, the indispensable condition any state of affairs must meet in order to exist in some possible world, is logical possibility. This is the dominance of the law of non-contradiction, that it cannot be contradictory. So it must meet the laws of logical possibility in order to exist in any world. But then there's physical possibility, and that's different. Something's physically possible if someone can do it. Physical possibility can vary from world to world. In a different world, you might be able to outrun Usain Bolt or out-rebound LeBron James. In a different possible world, you might be a redhead or have a hooked nose or be a race car driver. As long as there's no logical contradiction involved in the state of affairs, then it's a physical possibility and therefore a possible state of affairs. And don't overthink this, but it's possible that God could have genetically so constructed you in another world that you were able to do these things. That's the idea. A possible world is a complete state of affairs. Because we're typically contrasting this world with another possible world, every possible world must be closed as regards states of affairs. And Dr. Nash puts it this way. He says, a possible world is and must be so complete that any attempt to squeeze even one more state of affairs into that world is impossible. The reason is because that extra state of affairs would prove to be logically incompatible with the complete state of affairs that makes up that possible world. And so the reason why is because the book on that world has already been written. What on earth does that mean? So I'm calling this the book on world X. It could be world P, it could be world A, or world F. The idea is not that there's an actual physical book about each possible world. The idea is that the compilation of all the true propositions of all the states of affairs which exists in a possible world is denoted, or it's signified or referred to by mentioning the book on world or X or something of that sort. In possible worlds lingo, when they use the term the book, it's the whole deal, all of it, the entire system in every detail. And that's why he's saying you can't add anything to it, because it would be contradictory. Should this new point about books about possible worlds seem daunting, this is Nash, stop and think about the points you accepted earlier in this chapter. If all true and properly formulated propositions are eternal entities and are eternally true, then no great leap is required to conceive of the sum total of those propositions as composing the book on our world. Earlier I suggested the mind of God as a proper locus for all of these propositions. When one conceives of God as an omniscient being, that is, an eternally divine person who believes all true propositions and who holds no false beliefs, accepting the book on the real world requires no great leap of faith. If all true propositions subsist eternally in the eternal mind of God, whence comes any difficulty in calling the sum total of these propositions the book about the real world? The book about the real world exists in the mind of God, is the idea. This is a good time, he says, to explain my earlier point that a possible world is a complete state of logically possible affairs. Consider the totality of propositions corresponding to each logically possible state of affairs in some possible world. This complete set of propositions about possible world A is such that any attempt to add another proposition to the book about world A, that would be called the book on world A, would introduce a logical contradiction into that book. The book on World A is so complete that any other proposition one might attempt to add to the book will be logically incompatible with one of the other propositions in the book on World A. He's being a little redundant, but he wants to make sure that you get it the way he's talking. And so a possible world cannot be reduced to such limited states of affairs as the reign of King Henry VIII of England or the baseball career of Babe Ruth, of whom Dr. Nash was a big fan, even though he was before his time, or the presidency of Ronald Reagan. All of these examples are what some have called a slice of a possible world. And then he says this, and it's interesting: the heaven that Christians believe will follow physical death, the final judgment, and the end of the world should also be viewed as a slice of a possible world. The actual world does not end with the death of any or all human beings or with the destruction of the earth. So world here, that's your clue that world means everything. There's still something going when all those things have happened, and you have to think biblically in order to understand about how he means that, right? In the figure below, I allow 5 circles to stand for 5 possible worlds. So he has world A is the real world, and then these others are counterfactuals or modal pictures of how things might have been or could have been. They could be world B, C, D, E. Now, he doesn't do a whole lot with this, but when we're talking about this kind of thing, what we're addressing is we're looking at these other possible worlds is to understand the difference between a contingent truth and a necessary truth. So a contingent truths in our world would be, well, like that Donald J. Trump won the 2024 presidential election. And that it could have been different, right? It could have been that Kamala Harris won the election, or the final solution under the Nazis. That's a contingent truth. It's something that really happened in space and time, but it didn't have to be like that. So it has to be, we're thinking in terms of God's sovereignty, that God permitted it, although he did not cause it. Or the splitting of the atom, the Manhattan Project, and the splitting of the atom, and what has resulted from that, and the ability to have not only atom bombs and hydrogen bombs, but neutron bombs, and all of what they leave in their wake. And then Alexander Fleming, he didn't have to discover penicillin, right? And since that time, we've had this exponential increase in antibiotics. And so contingent truths are things that are true, but they didn't have to be. And oftentimes, they're good things. Sometimes, like with a final solution, they're bad things. And then there's contingent beings. Your parents didn't have to exist. You and I, we didn't have to exist. Abraham Lincoln or Mother Teresa didn't have to exist. They did, thank God. And so the idea of contingent truths and contingent beings these are things that could have been otherwise. And that's what's going on with possible worlds thought, is thinking about, well, what if? What if they had been otherwise? But then over against contingent truths and contingent beings, we have the necessary being. Also, we have a necessary truth. The necessary truths are the truths of logic, especially the law of non-contradiction. When we talk about the necessary being, that's God. In every world that is, there has to be that God, Yahweh, of the Hebrew scriptures and the Christian scriptures, that God exists in all of those worlds. He says we're now ready to relate contingent beings and truth to possible worlds. A contingent truth is true in some possible worlds and not others. The contingent truth, George Washington is the first president of the United States, is true in many possible worlds, including the actual world. But it's not true in every possible world. A contingent being exists in some possible worlds, but not all. You and I exist in the real world, but we also exist in many other possible worlds. But there are numerous possible worlds in which we never have and never will exist. Thinking about that long enough can increase one's humility. I'm going to take a drink right here. You think about that. If you think about the fact that there's many accounts of reality in which you don't have to have existed, it will hopefully make you appreciative of your existence and also have a humbling effect. He goes on to say, a necessary truth is one that is true in every possible world. The proposition, an object cannot be both round and square at the same time in the same sense, that's true in every possible world. The truths of mathematics are true in every possible world. There's no world where we could say that 2 plus 2 equals 3. There isn't. While contingent beings exist in some, but not all possible worlds, a necessary being i.e. God, exists in every possible world. Since God is a necessary being, God exists in every possible world. I will say more about this later in the chapter, he says. So now essential and non-essential properties, and this is Aristotle, like I said. He pointed out that many properties of a thing are non-essential or they are accidental. It doesn't mean that they, what we typically mean with accidental. It means just, it has to do with those things that are not essential. In the sense that they could be changed or lost without affecting the essence of a thing. For instance, when I was a young man in Rochester, New York, we had a restaurant in Pittsford, New York, called The Depot. And The Depot was a number of it was a really high-end restaurant. Everybody wanted to get into The Depot. And The Depot was literally 3 train cars that were put together in order to create this really classy restaurant. And it was a restaurant, but it actually did sit on a sidetrack, and it was still train cars. So it didn't change from being a train. It just was differently outfitted on the inside, but they were still train cars. Or going up into Newport from Pittsfield here, you go through Palmyra for a little bit, and off on the left-hand side of the road as I was going north in the past, there was, for many years, a train car that a particular lawyer had decided to turn into his office. He didn't put windows and all that sort of thing in there, so it must have been dark as a pocket inside. But although it was indeed a lawyer's office, it was still a train car. So the essence of the thing did not change. And he says a table, for example, could be painted a different color or moved to a different location or made shorter or taller, but it would still be a table. Its essence would be unchanged. All the changes cited would only affect non-essential characteristics of the table. But it would also be possible to change the table in ways that would alter it so drastically that it might no longer be a table. One might, for example, take a sledgehammer and smash it into kindling. Essential properties belong to the nature of a thing and cannot be changed or lost without altering the kind of thing that it is. So when you smash it to pieces, you have altered the kind of thing that it is. However, any change of a thing's non-essential properties would not change the kind of thing that it is. For instance, I have on the right hand of my body, I do not have a pinky finger. It was cut off in a door when I was 2 years old. A hospital door, interestingly, one of those big glass ones. The air brake was broken. But it's a non-essential thing. You, presumably, do have a pinky on your right hand, but it doesn't make me not a human being. I'm still a human being like you are, even though I'm missing a property that most all human beings have. Okay? And so the property or set of properties that make up the essence of something are definable in this way. E is an essential property of S, some substance or existing thing. And since E is an essential property of S, it means that if S loses E, then S ceases to be the kind of thing it is. If pinkies were essential to being humans, I would have lost something about my humanity. If Socrates, for example, loses the essential property of humanness, he is no longer a human being. The definition of an essential property in the language of possible worlds is this. If E is an essential property of Socrates, then Socrates possesses E in every possible world in which he exists. Because Socrates is a contingent being, he's not necessary, like God, he does not exist in every possible world, nor could he. But in every possible world where Socrates does exist, he possesses the essential property of humanness. This may seem so clear and obvious and almost redundant that you want to say, duh. But a non-essential property is one that can be lost without a thing ceasing to be the kind of thing it is. A human being may lose 1, 2, 3, or 4 limbs and still be a human being. There's a pretty famous military veteran, Travis, I'm forgetting his first name right now, who did indeed do just that and who is pretty highly regarded in media and in the public. Anyway, I think many of you know the individual to whom I'm referring, but he's still a human being, clearly, and he's married and has a wife who loves him and whom he loves, and he is without 4 of his limbs. Humans may lose their hair, a lot of them, Dr. Nash did in fact, their sight, and their appendix and still be humans. That is, still possess the essential property of humanness. A non-essential property of Socrates, such as baldness, is one that Socrates possesses in some of the possible worlds in which he exists, but not all. And so now he gets into possible worlds and the attributes of God. Some of the predicates applied to God denote not attributes or essential properties of God, but non-essential properties that relate God to his creatures. So Relational predicates like creator, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, ruler, and preserver do not denote divine attributes, but rather how he used them. A property like being the Lord of Israel is likewise a non-essential property. It is logically possible that God might not have had this property. He might never have created Israel, or Israel might never have accepted Yahweh as its God. Being Lord of Israel or creator of the world are not essential to the being of God. Utilizing the analysis earlier in this chapter, there are possible worlds in which God did not create the world, the earth. Also, see how world and worlds gets problematic there. This earth, or was not Lord of Israel. Once the essential properties or attributes of God are identified, one can be certain that any being lacking even one essential divine property could not be God. This is really important because there's a lot of people who have been messing with this recently, especially as far as God's foreknowledge. A being who lacks the essential property of omnipotence or omniscience or immutability, which means they don't change, would no longer qualify as a bearer of the title God. If the being called God lost just one of his essential properties, he would no longer be God. The divine attribute then is a property that God could not lose and continue to be God. Excuse me. It is an essential property of God. A divine attribute must be necessary to our idea of God. One might state that the essence of an individual person is that set of properties he or she possesses in every possible world in which he or she exists. So the idea is that if there's any property that one could be without and still be himself or herself, then that property is not essential to one's identity. The terminology of possible worlds can now be used to define an attribute of God. A divine attribute is a property of God in every possible world in which God exists, which would be all possible worlds. Just as some being in a possible world who lacked Socrates' essence could not be Socrates, so a possible being who lacked one of the divine attributes could not be God, would not qualify as bearer of the title God. This means that God is omnipotent, omniscient, and so on in every possible world in which he exists. And since, I contend, says Dr. Nash, God is a logically necessary being, it follows that God's essential properties are his in every possible world. So, God, if we're going to talk about him and have that word still have the meaning that it does to us, it can't change from one perception to another or from one world to the next. So now he deals with the Kenosis Theory of the incarnation. So we have in Philippians 2 this famous passage where Paul exhorts us. He's wanting the church to be unified, and he wants them to be of one mind, intent on one purpose, and that they would not be divided by relational problems. And he says to them, he's exhorting them to humility. Have this attitude in yourselves, which was also in Christ Jesus, who, although he existed in the form of God, did not regard equality with God a thing to be grasped. Notice that it says he existed in the form of God. He already was God. But he emptied himself, very interesting language, taking the form of a bondservant. He didn't empty himself by subtraction, but he emptied himself by addition. He emptied himself taking the form of a bondservant, which hid his glory, and being made in the likeness of men. Being found in appearance as a man, he then further humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. This is believed to be an early church hymn. We refer to it as the Carmen Christi. And it runs through from verse 5 through verse 11, where it talks about how every knee is going to bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue is going to confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. But what Dr. Nash is concerned with is that some theologians have done something inappropriate with this passage. He says, proponents of the Kenosis Theory, not the Kenosis passage, but the Kenosis Theory. So it's a formal theory advanced by theologically liberal theologians, especially in the 19th century and into the early 20th century, believe this passage teaches that during his sojourn on earth, Jesus Christ set aside certain divine attributes such as omnipotence and omniscience. And they get into like the things that Jesus has to say about his return, and they say he didn't really know when it was that he was coming back, and that's why we have some difficulties with our eschatology to be able to figure out when Jesus is going to return and that sort of thing. To quote from a fairly recent defense, this is from, is it Craig Keener? It's a Craig, I can't remember, Craig Evans. It's Craig Evans. To quote from a fairly recent defense of the Kenosis Theory, the theory holds that in becoming human, God the Son emptied himself or voluntarily relinquished such properties as omnipotence and omniscience. Remember, in Malachi, the Lord tells the Israelites, I, the Lord your God, change not, therefore you are not consumed, O sons of Israel. And so God does not change. The Bible is very clear about that. And were the second person of the Trinity, the Logos, were Jesus the Christ, to change as regards his deity, that would be a change within the triune Godhead that had existed from all eternity. It's just not biblical. This is not what is being taught. We speak about the incarnation. The implications of these remarks, when somebody like Craig Evans or any of the others associated with this, I especially think of C.H. Dodd, who is a theologian who I otherwise like, but then was distraught to discover that he was supporting this idea. They are indeed troubling. This person has given up the biblical concept of God. Divine attributes such as omnipotence and omniscience are essential properties of God. If Jesus Christ divested himself of even one divine attribute, he would have ceased to be God. That's important. I mean, this is what's going on in the creeds. When we say in the Nicene Creed that Jesus is, I believe in one God, the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth and of all things seen and unseen, and in one it's in his Son Jesus Christ, who is his only begotten Son, begotten of God before all worlds, God from God, light from light, very God from very God, begotten, not made, being of one substance with the Father, who for us men and for our salvation came down and was incarnate of the Virgin Mary. And so the idea is that God who is God, the second person of the Godhead, indeed entered into humanity and clothed himself with our flesh. The way that Hilary of Poitiers in the early church put it was, he said, remaining what he had always been, he became what he had not previously been. That's a good way to say it. So that Jesus took into himself humanity. So if Jesus Christ divested himself of even one divine attribute, he would have ceased to be God. Omnipotence and omniscience are, we suggested, properties of God in every possible world in which God exists. Therefore, any loss of even one essentially divine property would have the result that God, or in this case the Son of God, would cease to be God. So we appear to be left with one of two choices. Either proponents of the Kenosis Theory have a faulty understanding of God's essential properties, or they are willing to embrace a seriously mistaken view of the Incarnation, such that Jesus Christ could not have been fully God and fully man. The verse does not refer to Jesus' abandonment of any divine attributes, only certain privileges that that as God he already possessed. The King James says that he made himself of no reputation. So imagine this glorious being that the angels had previously worshipped in glory, and who now comes down here and enters into these humble settings and allows himself to be hidden, his glory to be muted, such that on the Mount of Transfiguration, the disciples get an eyeful of what Jesus is really like. And then in Revelation 1, when John, who had previously reclined with his head on the Lord's chest when they were at table, he now sees him as he really is. He says, I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day. I heard this voice behind me say, I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. He turns to see the one who spoke with him. He says, and I saw the Son of God. And then he gives this glorious description of Jesus. And he says, and I fell before him as a dead man. Jesus allowed his glory to be muted, to be hidden under flesh. And remember what the text says, have this attitude in yourselves, which was also in Christ Jesus, who, although he existed in the form of God, did not regard equality with God a thing to be grasped, something to be clung to, but emptied himself, not by ungodding himself, but emptied himself, taking the form of a bond servant. Jesus' emptying was an emptying of the radiance of his glory outwardly, so that it could be then clothed in human flesh and hidden. That's the idea. Okay, Philippians 2 verse 8 continues the theme by saying that he humbled himself. And about these words, the New Geneva Study Bible correctly observes, this is Dr. Nash speaking, Christ is not said to have removed from himself his identity as God. The phrase means that he humbled himself, relinquishing his heavenly status, not his divine being. The nature of his self-emptying is explained in terms of his taking the very nature of a servant, being found in appearance as a man, and becoming obedient to death. Nowhere in this magnificent passage is there a suggestion that Jesus Christ gave up or could give up any divine attribute. It would not. God does not change. The scripture is really clear about that in more places than just Malachi. Okay, using possible worlds thinking to oppose naturalism. So naturalism is that closed box. The universe, the cosmos is all there is, was, or ever shall be. We encountered it in the second chapter of this text. What makes the laws of rational inference different, says Dr. Nash, is the fact that they are logically necessary, not contingent. This means that the laws of logical inference exist in every possible world. Now, this is noteworthy. Just as some simple truth of arithmetic cannot be confined within the box of the natural order, so the law of non-contradiction and other laws of rational inference cannot be confined within the bounds of the natural order. Remember, the proponents of philosophical naturalism say that all there is the box. There's nothing other than matter plus time plus chance and energy, and everything can be explained in those naturalistic terms. The laws of logic and arithmetic exist inside the box, since humans who also exist inside the box can think about them, but they must also extend outside of the box. And it is this feature of the laws of logical inference that the naturalist is helpless to explain on his naturalistic principles. They can't explain why this is inescapable, and it's inescapable for believer and unbeliever. Okay, so that's just one way to argue against naturalism. Now we're dealing with what's called the ontological argument. This is from St. Anselm. Anselm is from the 11th century into the very beginning of the 12th century. He's a wonderful writer, a brilliant doctor of the church. I would highly commend to your reading his book, Why the God-Man, or Cur Deus Homo. But according to Anselm, God is, this is called the ontological argument, the argument from God's isness, from what he is like. God is that being than which a greater being cannot be conceived. Part of Anselm's point is that if more people had a clearer understanding of the nature of God, they would have fewer reservations about his existence. Anyone who seriously doubts the existence of God, Anselm believed, suffers from an inadequate grasp of God's nature. And so interestingly, Einstein said that he believed in God, but not the God of the theologians, because he was beneath the dignity of the God who he saw as having created everything when he was dealing in the world of physics and of quantum physics. So he's just saying this God is beyond those things. So if one were to understand, I think Einstein would have been helped by an understanding of the ontological argument. What does it mean to say that God is that being than which a greater cannot be conceived? Anselm is not endorsing a relativistic and circular view of God that's self-referential in my mind, or such that Mr. Jones could identify God with the greatest being he's capable of conceiving, and Miss Smith can end up with a different concept of God. This is like God being factor X and each one of us defining what factor X is. Nor is Anselm suggesting that any human being can attain a complete and perfect concept of this greatest conceivable being. His definition functions as a kind of boundary or standard that any adequate concept of God must approach. Nash describes a man, Mr. Jones, whose conception of God is deficient, in that his idea of God is a being who is neither omnipotent with regard to power, nor omniscient with regard to knowledge. His conception is of a being who did not and could not create the world and cannot know the future. Like Aristotle's prime mover, he's co-eternal with the world, and he cannot know the future since it hasn't occurred yet. Jones is content with this conception of God since it helps him explain how there can be so much evil and suffering in the world. And this is what's going on with some thinking when it comes to people thinking in this direction. They try to account for suffering and evil by decreasing the biblical picture of who God is. Now let us suppose that a friend introduces Mr. Jones to Anselm's thinking about God, and that Mr. Jones is interested in exploring Anselm's theory in more detail. God is that being than which none greater can be conceived. One day Jones asks himself if his finite God is that being than which a greater cannot be conceived. Surely, it seems, Mr. Jones can conceive of a being greater than his finite God, namely a God who has perfect knowledge about the future, along with the kind of power usually in view when traditional Christians think about God being all-powerful. Anselm believes that if anyone thinks about a being who's not the greatest conceivable being, the way Mr. Jones does, he or she is not thinking about God. Mr. Jones's finite God isn't God, it's something else. In other words, Anselm's definition sets up a standard that any proposed candidate for God must satisfy in order to qualify. It's got to be that being than which no greater can be conceived. If the being someone conceptualizes as God is surpassable in greatness by some other candidate for God, the first candidate is disqualified. Suppose then that Mr. Jones upgrades his concept of God to include the following attributes: omnipotence, omniscience, omnipresence, love, holiness, and any other properties present in Christian thinking about God. Mr. Jones believes he is thinking about a being than which a greater cannot be conceived. Let us also suppose that Mr. Jones holds back in just one respect. That's a pretty important respect. He believes that the being he conceives of and that he calls God exists only as an idea in his mind. And so this is not just Jones, but this is many different people. That perhaps there's this God, but I've dreamed him up in my mind, and this is what he'd be like if he were really real. Miss Smith comes along and advises him politely that he still doesn't have it right. While her concept of God includes all of the same essential properties that Jones attributes to God, she and Jones differ in one major respect. Jones believes that the God he is thinking about exists in some possible worlds, but happens not to exist in the real world. In the real world, Jones' God exists only as an idea in Jones' mind. Miss Smith, however, points out that Jones' God cannot be that being than which a greater being cannot be conceived, and that this is so because, as Miss Smith points out, the God she is conceiving does not just exist in some possible worlds other than the real world. The God she's thinking about is a logically necessary being who necessarily exists in every possible world, including the real world. Consider the choice between two candidates for God who are alike in every respect but one. While Jones's God exists only in some possible worlds, but does not exist in the real world, Miss Smith's candidate exists in every possible world, which means that he is also and necessarily exists in the real world. Now, he asks, which of these two candidates is the only one that satisfies Anselm's definition of God, namely that being than which a greater cannot be conceived? The answer is obvious. But notice what we've learned. Since the only being who satisfies the standard of being God exists necessarily, he therefore exists in every possible world. But if God exists in every possible world, it follows that he also exists in the real world. Therefore, God exists in the real world. Any candidate for God that does not exist necessarily cannot be God. I seem to have messed up here. Cannot be God. It is impossible, all the way down to the bottom of the page. Sorry about that, guys. It is impossible then for Jones's God to be the greatest conceivable being. So the takeaway from all of that is it sounds circular, but it's not. It's saying if there is a God, and if Anselm's account of God is a correct statement that God is that being than which no greater can be conceived, well, then that has to include existence. You have to include existence because if one has all these things hypothetically but doesn't have them in reality, that's not the greatest God we can conceive of. So now this he says, possible worlds and perfect being theology. Many contemporary religious thinkers believe there is another profitable line of thinking made possible by Anselm's definition of God. This second line of thinking explores ways in which Anselm's understanding of God as the most perfect being opens up possibilities for thinking about God's nature. While the Bible has much to say about God's nature, many have been skeptical about how successful people can be in reaching conclusions about God's nature via reasoning that is independent of special revelation. Meaning, how far can the unregenerate mind get towards really having a conception of God? Remember that there's this disagreement. Augustine thinks everything has to be, I believe, in order to understand. Whereas when we deal with Aquinas, Aquinas thinks that the mind without the Holy Spirit's help can reason from the natural world to the existence of God, or it can get there from the scriptures, either way. And so what the idea here, what Nash is putting forward when he talks about this, is that there's some traction with Anselm's ontological argument as regards what human beings might be capable of without the Bible. Imagine a candidate for God that lacks such specific attributes of God as omnipotence, omniscience, omnipresence, love, holiness, or any other of the things that we know through special revelation, which means through the Bible. Could any being lacking any one of these properties possibly qualify as that being than which a greater cannot be conceived? If we have two candidates for the title of God and one is morally perfect while the other is lacking in holiness, can the second candidate qualify as that being than which a greater cannot be conceived? And then ask the same question with all of his regular attributes. Think now of someone with little or no prior contact with special revelation. The person we always hear about, the indigenous person running around on an island somewhere or deep in the Amazon jungle someplace. Is it possible that such a person, armed with Anselm's approach to God's nature, he or she gets it in their head to think of, if there is a God, which seems to be, we know from missiology that that's there in the thinking of pretty much all people. If there is a God, and if that God is that being than which none greater can be conceived, then what would happen in that person's mind? Could they arrive at a fairly complete listing of the properties of the biblical God? And explore this, Nash exhorts us, with respect to the contrast between a personal God and a pantheistic God, deity, one where everything is God. The trees are God, and the grass is God, and the water is God, and the sky is God. And so a personal God versus a pantheistic deity. Which of these two is more perfect, greater than the others? I'm not sure how far I wish to push this, but it does strike me as an interesting way to think about God's nature. So Nash is saying, if somebody were to approach thoughts about God, they might get pretty far in knowing who God was just by reasoning along the lines of the ontological argument or something like that. So I just want to show you, Dr. Luke says this in Acts 17 when Paul is speaking at Mars Hill. He says, "The God who made the world and all things in it, since he's Lord of heaven and earth, does not dwell in temples made with hands, nor is he served by human hands, as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all people life and breath and all things. And he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined that there are appointed times and the boundaries of their habitation." Now listen, "that they would seek God, if perhaps they might grope for him and find him, though he's not far from each one of us." So Paul seems to think that we might be able to get fairly far in our knowledge of God. I don't know that you can get, there's no way from the natural world that we're going to get the idea of Christ having died on the cross, and of course it is the knowledge of Christ that saves, but that we might have a fair degree of knowledge about God himself just by reasoning this way. How far towards an accurate conception of the God who is can the unconverted mind get if it approaches the consideration with a tool like the ontological argument? Only God himself knows. That's me saying that, not Nash. But only God himself knows, but it's really an interesting way to think. Okay, so now we come to the end here and deal with middle knowledge. If God knows, and there's a whole lot more to be said about possible worlds thought. These are just the things that Nash touches on. There is an appendix to this chapter. I'm not going to try to address the appendix because it's a little too technical. But middle knowledge. If God knows all about the future and all that will happen in the future, then how can any human being be free in any real sense? You see why people might say that? Like if God knows that you're going to eat a ham sandwich at 3 o'clock in the afternoon just prior to supper today, and he knows that and has always known that, how can you be free to do that? Are you not just somehow doing something that you were predestined to do and that you must do? That's the question. So we'll cover this in depth in the 14th chapter of this text, of this book. This is me saying this. But for now, the Jesuit philosopher Louis de Molina raised the concept of God's middle knowledge to deal with this issue. He was a counter-reformationist. He's in the same century as Luther and Calvin, but he's a Roman Catholic who's trying to put the Protestant Reformation back in the box. He's brilliant, And his work is to try to answer the questions that Protestantism has posed to the Roman Catholic Church. But I don't want to get too much into that. I want to address the fact that he brings up this idea of middle knowledge. Nash says one of the easiest ways to see how Molina defends human freedom, God knowing you're going to have that ham sandwich, how could you possibly be free? One of the easiest ways to see how he defends human freedom is to use the language of possible worlds. As we know, there's a very large number of possible worlds, which means complete states of affairs, only one of which is the actual or real world. In order for one possible world to differ from another, at least one state of affairs must be different in one world from the other. Let us imagine a possible world in which Judas Iscariot is offered 30 pieces of silver to betray Jesus. That's the real world. We know at least two things about this possible state of affairs. We know that it is also part of the actual world, and we know that the hypothetical proposition, if Judas is offered 30 pieces of silver, then he will betray Jesus, is true. Now Nash asks us to imagine a counterfactual, or a modal kind of a thing, something that's a possible thing. Now imagine a second possible world that is the same as the real world, but with only one difference. In this second possible world, instead of being offered 30, Judas is offered only 20 pieces of silver. This possible state of affairs is referred to by the following sentence. If Judas had been offered 20 pieces of silver, he would have betrayed Jesus. Is this second hypothetical statement true or false? Well, we're human beings. We can only guess. One way to view this second hypothetical situation is to imagine two more possible worlds. In one of them, Judas is offered 20 pieces of silver and he betrays Jesus. In the other, Judas is offered 20 pieces of silver and he refuses to betray Jesus. He says, I doubt that any human being could ever know which of these two possible worlds would have been actual if Judas had been offered only 20 pieces of silver. But it is basic to Molina's theory that God knows the content of every possible world. God knows what Judas would have done if he'd been offered 20 pieces of silver, or only one, or none. God knows what Judas would have freely done in every possible world. Molina called this strange kind of knowledge middle knowledge because it supposedly comes between two other kinds of knowledge that God can have. The Roman Catholic philosopher Reginald Garrigou-Lagrange explains. He says, this knowledge is called middle by reason of its proper object, which is the conditional future, or the conditionally free act of the future. So, if the breaking point, I'm just going to pause this for a second, if the breaking point for Judas to betray Jesus is a certain number, maybe it's 25, or maybe it's 26, or maybe it's 27 pieces of silver, we don't know, but knowledge of what it would take would mean that in terms of God's sovereignty, he doesn't have to be doing anything to manipulate Judas in order to have the temptation put before Judas be sufficient for it to take him down. If God knows that 30 pieces of silver is Judas's price, that's what he is willing to betray the Son of God for, then the temptation, he's not being forced to do anything. He's still free. Think of that ham sandwich I was talking about before. He has this knowledge, and his knowledge corresponds together with his sovereignty. That's the idea. Okay, I need to shut up now. It is intermediate between the purely possible, which is the object of God's knowledge of simple intelligence, and the contingent future, which is the object of God's knowledge of vision. So there's a middle knowledge is being placed in between two polarities. One is what God just simply knows to be truth by his godlike intelligence. The other is God's relationship to time. God is in time differently than we are, and God experiences all time as being in the present. This is kind of an always thing in the church's perception of God. God doesn't have the same relationship to time that we have. And so now there's this contrast. God's simple intelligence regarding what is and what could be and everything about how he's made the world, and then also God's knowledge of vision, the fact that God sees what's going to happen down the road. So this middle knowledge is in between those things. By this middle knowledge, according to Molina, God knows previous to any predetermining decree how a free will would act if placed in certain circumstances, and how in certain other cases it would decide otherwise. After that, God decides, according to his benevolent designs, to render this free will effective by placing it in those circumstances more or less favorable or unfavorable to it, so that God arranges for there to be that the priests, when they put their heads together to figure out how much do we want to bribe this Judas guy, that they would use 30 pieces of silver. In other words, by means of his natural knowledge, God knows everything that can be. By means of his simple vision, God knows what will be, that is, what will occur in the real world. And by means of his middle knowledge, God knows what would be if the world were different in some way. By means of his middle knowledge, God knows all possible worlds and what each possible individual would do in them. God then decrees certain antecedent conditions with full knowledge of how the human agent will act in that situation. But God's decree does not violate the freedom of the agent. So by God putting those things there, he's not forcing you to do something. He's not putting a gun to your head. He's just giving to you the things that will or won't cause you to respond in a certain way. In the case of Judas, God knows that if Judas is offered 30 pieces of silver, Judas will, of his own free will, choose to betray Jesus. God actualizes the set of circumstances in which his will is accomplished, but God's decree in no way interferes with the free choice of his creatures. So if we were to map this out as far as what's being said, over on the left-hand side, this is the purely possible, what God in his intelligence just knows what is possible. And over on the right-hand side is God's knowledge of vision, his actual view of the future, because he has a different relationship to time than us. But then in the middle is things that don't happen, but God knows that they could happen. Okay, so let's go to the Bible. 1 Samuel 23. Then they told David, saying, Behold, the Philistines are fighting at Keilah. The men of Keilah are relatives of David's. They're in the same tribe as he is. And they are plundering the threshing floors. So David inquired of the Lord, saying, Shall I go and attack these Philistines? And the Lord said to David, Go and attack the Philistines, and deliver Keilah. But David's men said to him, Behold, we're afraid here in Judah. How much more then if we go to Keilah against the ranks of the Philistines? Then David inquired of the Lord once more. He just wants to make sure. And the Lord answered him and said, Arise, go down to Keilah, for I will give the Philistines into your hand. So David and his men went to Keilah and fought with the Philistines, and they led away their livestock and struck them with great slaughter. Thus David delivered the inhabitants of Keilah. He delivered his own relatives, these people who were of his tribe. Now it came about when Abiathar, the son of Ahimelech, fled to David at Keilah, that he came down with an ephod in his hand. When it was told Saul that David had come to Keilah, Saul said, God has delivered him into my hand, for he has shut himself in by entering a city with double gates and bars. And so Saul summoned all the people for war to go down to Keilah to besiege David and his men. Now David knew that Saul was plotting evil against him, so he said to Abiathar the priest, Bring the ephod here. And then David said, O Lord God of Israel, your servant has heard for certain that Saul is seeking to come to Keilah to destroy the city on my account. Will the men of Keilah, my relatives, surrender me into his hand? Will Saul come down just as your servant has heard? O Lord God of Israel, I pray, tell your servant. And the Lord said, He will come down. Then David said, Will the men of Keilah surrender me and my men into the hand of Saul? And the Lord said, They will surrender you. Then David and his men, about 600, arose and departed from Keilah, and they went wherever they could go, which meant they were going out into a pretty harsh wilderness around there. That's a very arid area. When it was told Saul that David had escaped from Keilah, he gave up the pursuit. That's God's middle knowledge. It didn't happen. The men of Keilah did not give David up, but God knew that were David to remain there, they would have. So when we talk about this statement, will the men of Keilah surrender me and my men into the hand of Saul? And the Lord said, they will surrender you. This is God's middle knowledge. And so the middle knowledge, I put there the term the subjunctive. The subjunctive mood, when we're speaking about language, means the mood of possibility. This is what could be. And so middle knowledge is speaking about this. It's important to distinguish between a presentation of middle knowledge as an account of God's knowledge versus its use as an explanation of how human free will fits into a universe in which God has perfect knowledge of the future and exercises sovereign control over all things. It is this second role for middle knowledge that appears most problematic. Many believe there is merit in recognizing that God's knowledge includes middle knowledge. If God only knows what will happen instead of knowing what would happen under every conceivable set of circumstances, it's difficult to see how God could control the world. And so Nash ends the chapter with this statement, and he's going to have a little appendix after this. Molina's success in offering a way to understand a middle knowledge approach to God's approach to bringing about his will in human affairs without infringing on our human freedom seems much more problematic. It does seem that way. Nevertheless, it makes an interesting subject for a class discussion. And like I said, if you want especially to deal with this topic, go look at William Lane Craig on middle knowledge. I think that there's a full 30-something videos of his online about God's middle knowledge, about Louis de Molina. But then think about this passage in your Bible. No temptation has overtaken you but such as is common to man, and God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond that which you are able. God knows your breaking point. But with the temptation will provide the way of escape also, so that you will be able to endure it. James says, let no man say when he's being tempted that I'm being tempted of the Lord, for God himself will tempt no man. God is not like to hang a carrot in front of us and then punish us for responding to the carrot. That's not the point. But in order for this passage in 1 Corinthians 10 to be true, it means that God has to, in terms of middle knowledge, the subjunctive, he has to know what you are capable of. If he will not allow you to be tempted beyond that which you are able, then he knows you and he knows everything about you, not only what you have done and what you will do, but what you could do. All right, and we'll end there. That's a long